Okay, perfect. All right, I will begin then. And thanks everyone for being patient with the few technical difficulties that we've had. So I'm your first speaker today, and today I'm going to be talking about the Kusama network landscape. And to give you a little bit of background about myself, um, I'm leading a lot of the ecosystem development initiatives in Parity Technologies, specifically around ecosystem growth. So one of my jobs is to essentially convince projects to join the Polkadot and Kusama ecosystems and provide them the help they need in order to be situated within these ecosystems. I would want to apologize in advance because I didn't actually have quite as much time as I initially intended to prepare for this talk as I wanted to, but hopefully the listeners can still get some insights from this talk and walk away knowing a little bit more than they had before. So I'm going to split my talk up into 3 categories, and if I freeze at any given time, just please let me know and I'll try to fix it. And so I'll split my talk into 3 sections. So first, I'll give a little bit of background about Kusama, a little bit of background about slot auctions, crowd loans, and kind of where the current state of Kusama is. Then I'm going to talk about the Kusama community, how the Kusama community kind of came about and how it's a little bit different from Polkadot and the historical reasons for why that could be the case. As well as finally, I would like to talk a little bit about Kusama Builders. Who are some of the builders? How do you find these builders? And what do some of these builders think about when kind of building stuff within the Kusama ecosystem? So first, with background, right? Obviously, I would like to start about, in case people here already didn't know what Kusama was, right? I would just like to say that kind of the surface level answer of what Kusama is that it's Polkadot's canary network with basically almost the same code as Polkadot, and that it enables developers to kind of develop and deploy their product a little bit more rapidly compared to what they could otherwise do within the Polkadot ecosystem. And many times the original pitch was that the code for Polkadot is kind of tested here before it goes live within the Kusama network. But what is seen originally as a canary or a trial network for Polkadot applications has begun to evolve into quite more than that. And within this conversation and this talk that I'm giving, you'll maybe begin to see some reasons why this is the case. Why Kusama is not just a canary network for Polkadot, but it's much more than that. So I think you can't really talk about Kusama without talking about slot auctions and slot distributions. So both Kusama and Polkadot support what are called parachains. And parachains are essentially the fundamental pillar, you could say, that supports these networks and supports these applications within these ecosystems. So both Polkadot and Kusama also have relay chains. And the Kusama relay chain can support up to 100 parachains for each block included. So for each transaction block that's kind of included per block, about 100 parachains transactions can be included. Now, what this means is that there's a limited number of parachains, right? And if you further kind of break down these 100 or so included parachains per block into kind of more specific examples, about 10 to 30 of these parachains are going to be what's called common good parachains. So these are going to be stuff like bridge hubs, like bridges to, for example, other networks, for example, bridges to Polkadot, bridges to various other blockchains within the Polkadot ecosystem that might not necessarily be the Polkadot mainnet itself. It could be utility parachains, for example, a parachain like StateMine that enables various stablecoins to be minted, and other common good parachains can also kind of be created. So what this means is that it leaves essentially 40 to 90 leased slots that are possible for parachain developers to potentially acquire. And this means that all of these leased slots are quite competitive to get. And just quick note is that this 100 parachain number doesn't actually include the 50 or so parathreads that can also execute per block that are not part of this 100 parachain number. So basically, within these limited number of parachain slots, developers need to also consider kind of how long their slots can last, and what the lease period is. So compared to Polkadot, where the slot duration, as some of you may know, is up to 2 years per parachain and a lease period of every 6 months. So that means there's 6-month time intervals in Polkadot, for example, for developers to kind of auction off their slot for, right? To basically get their slot for. So for example, they can get it up for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, etc. Right? Whereas on Kusama, the slot duration is 48 weeks total, maximum, with the lease period interval of possibly 6 weeks multiples, right? So for example, it could be 24 weeks or 48 weeks as an example. So the biggest kind of topic that people are is making a lot of Kusama holders excited these days, and Kusama users, potential Kusama contributors, right, is the concept of crowd loans. So crowd loans are essentially an open and permissionless way for teams to raise Kusama for a Parachain slot, and users can essentially loan you their Kusama to help you win that slot. And in order to basically incentivize people to contribute to these crowd loans, because obviously people are not just going to want to give away the tokens for no reason, right? These Parachain teams are creating incentives for contribution. For example, usually by distributing a token or distributing other rights they have that the users will have within the network if they contribute a certain amount. So on the surface, right, the only cost to contributors is opportunity cost, right? It's basically the opportunity cost in Kusama in 6-week lease period intervals up to 48 weeks to kind of put their money in. And then at the end of the auction time cycle or the lease time cycle, all funds that are used for auctions are going to be returned at the end of the slot. So that's really good. But then we see that it's a little bit, I think it goes a little bit deeper than just opportunity cost to kind of determine why you could say crowd loans is kind of such a big deal, right? Because I think this really represents sort of an evolution in which projects can actually acquire funds for their projects compared to previous ways to fundraise, such as IDOs and IEOs, because such a way to fundraise, because you're kind of guaranteed to get your original principal back in terms of KSM tokens at the end of the slot, it's much less likely that you're susceptible to scams or other kind of issues when kind of contributing to these crowd loans. And also it kind of creates completely different economics for basically the creation of projects and distribution of projects in the future. So I think crowd loans are definitely likely to be one of these kind of concepts that really catches on within the Kusama community and beyond. And so to give you, so in case some of you didn't know about Kusama auctions, right? The first 5 auctions for Kusama have completed, and they've been quite successful. So the first auction on Kusama began on June 15th, 2021 with Karura. And then the 5th one was in July 13th of 2021. And in total, the first to 5th slots kind of raised over 10% of the total Kusama supply to be locked within the Parachain slots. And after these pretty successful slot auctions concluded, there was this period of time essentially in which projects had to onboard their functionality within the Kusama network. So when these Kusama parachains first kind of began to be live, they were just kind of essentially shell parachains without any real functionality. So around late July to early August, it's when teams, for example, started to actually implement functionality within these parachains. So one of the earliest ones was StatesMine back in July 26th, when there was a on-chain upgrade that allowed users then on StatesMine to actually create assets and NFTs on that first parachain. And now, in case you guys haven't heard, as of yesterday, the 6th parachain slot is now happening. And the reasoning behind the large time gap between the 5th and the 6th parachain slot is because we essentially wanted to determine that there wasn't any major technical issues between the 5th and the 6th slot before we began the 6th slot. So now that we determined that many issues have been fixed and things are running smoothly, the 6th to 10th slots hopefully are going to be a little bit more smoother than the 1st to 5th in terms of deploying the Parachain functionalities. So the current 5-week auction schedule is scheduled to start yesterday, as well as end on the week of September 29th, 2021. So things are happening pretty quickly. And then sometime after the second wave of Parachain slots, after the 6th to 10th auction concludes, there's going to be a third wave of Kusama Parachain slots. Now, it's a little bit unclear to us yet when we will truly determine that everything is fully stable between the 1st and the 10th slot and beyond. So basically what we know right now is that sometime after we determine that everything is stable, the Kusama Council will essentially initiate new auctions every 2 weeks until the chain is fully saturated with auctioned off parachains. And so I really recommend everybody look at the Polkadot network and Kusama network blogs to kind of determine how some of these parachains kind of technically, I guess, implemented as well as operate these parachains before, during, and after they won the slot auction. So there's quite a large number of resources available for users to kind of read about it. And I think after the first 5 Parachain slots have concluded, I think there's going to be a lot more strategies around crowd loans and slot auctions that have been developed that weren't developed at the very beginning. So definitely the blog on our network, on the Polkadot network and the Kusama network are interesting reads, but there's also a lot of third-party information, for example, projects specific information that users can take a look at and to kind of infer maybe their crowd loan auctioning strategies for projects as well as for users. So next I would like to talk a little bit about the Kusama community and how it came up. And so backtrack a little bit to the beginning first few days of Kusama. So essentially, initially Kusama KSM tokens were distributed to users who bought DOT in a 1-to-1 ratio before DOT was redenominated 1-to-100. So back then there were about 10 million dots, and now there's 1 billion or so dots before any sort of inflation occurred. And many of these initial users who actually received these KSM were institutional users, as well as users who didn't really kind of understand the value of KSM at the time. And many of these early institutional kind of users who received these KSM just sold their tokens because as I said, they didn't see the value. And because there were fewer early holders that were concentrated like other tokens, the KSM token distribution now is actually very broad. There's a very broad subset and kind of set of users that actually kind of hold these tokens. So what projects are noticing is that there's fewer large institutions that hold it, there's fewer percentage of regular users, and that Kusama as a community on average is more community driven than something even like Polkadot, which already is quite community driven based on, for example, the diversity of contributions to the Polkadot repo. So this makes it somewhat difficult in a sense for projects to kind of truly determine where they need to look at to find users that can contribute, for example, to their crowd loans or kind of get excited about their Kusama projects. So the pitch that Parity often has for projects, right, or for users is that doing crowd loans on Polkadot means you don't necessarily need to have big pockets to become a parachain, just big ideas, right? But that also kind of presumes that you're able to find the right communities within the Polkadot ecosystem and Kusama ecosystem to support your endeavors. So unfortunately, it's actually quite difficult to track specific Kusama communities because it's so distributed and because there's many sort of different types of identities, as I mentioned, and many different types of communities within the broader Kusama community. So I think, however, what we did is we asked a few people internally for some of the some of the I guess places where Parity employees actually go to look at specific Kusama communities. And some of these resources, for example, could be kusamaproject.com for a specific list of Kusama building projects. It could be Discord for these projects that you find on kusamaproject.com, and then discussing with these projects and then looking at the specific supporters of these existing Kusama projects. Surprisingly, the Reddit channels, the subreddits of Kusama and Polkadot are actually extremely popular. So I think it could be pretty interesting for projects to actually look into these communities to actually try to potentially convince these users within these communities to contribute to these crowd loans, as well as there's quite a few shitposting community channels that you can find on Telegram and other mediums. Some of the larger ones that people internally have recommended are, for example, Bag Hunters and Polkadot Unofficial. Some of these channels are not Kusama focused, but there's a large number of Kusama supporters nonetheless within these resources. And finally, I'm going to dedicate my last section to talk about Kusama Builders. So what's interesting about Kusama Builders is that the type of builders within Kusama is actually quite different to some extent compared to Polkadot builders. So, and this is largely due to the technological differences that Kusama and Polkadot has. Even though there's relatively few differences, these differences actually do mean quite a bit when it comes to kind of convincing different types of people to dedicate to different communities. So, for example, on the Kusama ecosystem, there's lower barriers to entry for parachain development. There's lower bond requirements for validators and parachains. There's lower slashing penalties, faster iteration, and there's latest technology. And what that enables is really, instead of kind of enterprise-focused applications on Polkadot, we are likely going to see more experimental applications as well as more retail-focused applications, more early-stage startup applications. Instead of financial applications that require high security, we're going to see maybe retail-focused financial applications that don't require bank-like security, but maybe require a small amount of kind of maybe give each user a small amount of finance instead of dealing with large numbers. And as well as, of course, on Kusama, the original intended application was this kind of pre-production environment for Polkadot. So that application use case for Kusama will always stay there. And when it comes to kind of building on Kusama, there's really many ways to develop for builders, right? I'm not going to get into all the differences right now, but essentially you could build a independent substrate-based parachain that's bridged, an independent substrate-based chain that is later bridged to the Kusama network. You could build a Kusama parachain or parathread. You could build a runtime on top of a parachain or parathread, and you could build on top of a set of smart contracts on a parachain or a parathread. And each of these ways to build on Kusama has its trade-offs and advantages. And what this really shows is that there's really a myriad of ways for builders to kind of consider, and there's a taste of a type of development process for pretty much everyone within the Kusama ecosystem, as well as in Polkadot to some extent. So to further kind of divide up some popular types of Kusama application builders that we see right now, there's really three really notable types of Kusama builders right now. So one is the builder that's primarily building Kusama-only parachains. So these are basically parachains that aren't necessarily, at least for the foreseeable future, targeting the Polkadot ecosystem, but for various reasons, they only target the Kusama ecosystem. And the reasons why these people would target primarily Kusama is because maybe they don't want to raise as much money for a Polkadot parachain, or maybe they want to iterate quicker, etc. And so, for example, Robonomics, as an example, doesn't want a Polkadot parachain until at least 2 years later, and they feel like Kusama is actually currently a better fit for their particular development activities. Right now, the broadest subset of Kusama builders, though, are still people who are building Kusama parachains to go along with their Polkadot parachains. So these are kind of most of the most well-known builders with the ecosystem, like the Kuroras, the Moon River, the Kalas, and the Genshiros, for example. And the reasons why people would want to build Kusama parachains along with their Polkadot parachains are manifold, right? So this could be, for example, being able to target different communities between Kusama and Polkadot, because as I mentioned, the communities are quite different from one another. This could be wanting to test their application on Kusama first before launching on Polkadot. And this could also potentially be for some sketchier applications and builders, for example, to launch 2 different types of tokens to capture more overall economic value within 2 different ecosystems, if that is their primary driver. And the final type of Kusama application builder that's, I think, pretty notable right now is builders who are building on top of Kusama Parachains. So as I mentioned before, there's quite a few ways where you could build applications that are not necessarily a parachain or a thread themselves, but the great majority of applications in the future are actually going to be built on top of parachains, because there's just nearly unlimited number of slots for Kusama applications, but a limited number of parachain slots. So one really notable example of this right now is the Remark application, which is this NFT application built by one of the former Web3 Foundation employees. So if we look at Kusama Builders in the future, then, right, basically right now what is happening is that builders within the Kusama ecosystem are primarily building Kusama isolated parachains. So that means that these parachains are primarily secluded to within the Kusama ecosystem, but don't necessarily interact that much with the Polkadot ecosystems, etc. But with the quick advent, I think, of bridged parachains through, for example, the Polkadot and Kusama bridge, in the very near future, I think there's going to be a lot of interoperability between Polkadot and Kusama. Right now, there's different holders of Kusama compared to Polkadot, but there's still overall a relatively similar community, a builder community between Kusama and Polkadot. But in the future, there's not only going to be different holders of Kusama and Polkadot, but also the different builder communities will also evolve within Kusama as applications began to be, as more applications are begun to be developed on top of Kusama parachains. And right now, finally, there's the greatest percentage of builders within the Kusama ecosystem that are also building Polkadot parachains. But in the future, there's going to be an increasing number of independent Kusama builders. And that actually concludes my talk. Sorry if I didn't practice nearly as much for the talk, but hopefully all of you got some insights into the Kusama community, the Kusama builder community, as well as how Kusama works in general. Thank you very much, and would love to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Eric. Hopefully you can hear me better now. It's super exciting, the Kusama parachains, and it's interesting to see how you talked about, looking forward in the future there, how the Kusama and Polkadot ecosystem will become more interoperable, but also the development for each will become, more separable with different groups and for the different use cases as they get built out. And it looks like Kusama, for the early stage startups is really where it's at right now. And then eventually more enterprises, business to business solutions, and the whole works into the ecosystem. So yeah, super exciting. Not too many specific questions, mainly people that are in high support of Kusama. So that's great to see that your audience loves you. Yeah,
amazing to hear that.
Yeah, definitely. I guess, my one question is, looking forward, let's just say, 2 years up to 5 years in the future, how, can you give a glimpse into how you see Kusama parachains, 5 years from now? And like, for example, with Ethereum 5 years ago until now, it's been quite different, and there could be a lot of evolutions potentially. Do you have any thoughts into the long-term future of Kusama parachains?
Yeah, I think as both Kusama and Polkadot mature quite a bit, I think Kusama might evolve into, this is personal opinion, of course, a little bit something even less of a canary network for Polkadot than now, even though it's always going to be a canary network in the sense that breaking updates are going to be introduced in Kusama before Polkadot. And Polkadot's always going to want to make sure that things are going to be tested on Kusama first. But in terms of the distribution of builders on Kusama, I mean, as I mentioned in the talk, right, definitely the retail-focused applications, I think, are going to be pretty dominant. And basically anybody who doesn't necessarily require a large amount of financial security for their applications are going to find Kusama just a more feasible way to deploy the applications compared to many of the options available on Polkadot today. Definitely,
great answer. Well, thank you so much for that intro, Eric. I think that was a great overview for the viewers, and all the best with your continued work.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Up next, we have Soda Watanabe, founder of A Star Network, talking about multi-virtual machines like EVM and WASM and dApp hubs on Kusama. And we will be heading to talk to Soda in a quick second.